Chapter 14 Hunting 55 Flo Cricket. The fall of 1955 found us still searching for the ideal hunting area. We found what looked pretty good at the Eau Claire, just a postal address halfway between North Bay and Mattawa, about 5 miles south of No. 17 highway. Elmer Wilson and Alan Lee drove with me to find out what we were getting into sometime in September. The building, pointed out to us by the farmer who owned it, was certainly no palace, but the glowing report he gave us about the hunting in the area outshadowed all its disadvantages. He would act as hunting guide and promised to clean up the house and add a few things like stovepipes, if the rest of the gang agreed to rent it after we consulted them at home. Some time later I sent a $5 deposit with a letter confirming our deal. This was the first year for John Rogers and Frank Lee to join us, and Ellis, Bang, George, and Elmer and myself made a party of 7. When we arrived early Sunday morning before the hunt season, everything was just as we had seen it before, only worse. There was broken glass from the windows, a few holes here and there, nothing had been cleaned up, and a few chickens were roosting over an old rusty cook stove. Our farmer friend claimed he did not receive my letter, which we doubted was true, and the chickens did it for Frank, who hated everything that grew feathers. It took some time, considerable discussion, and a lot of nerve to decide to stay, rather than to go back home. The farmer's house was about 200 yards across a clearing in front of ours, and the well was about halfway between. He owned a cow, 2 horses, and about 200 white chickens, all free to roam the clearing and the surrounding bush. Everything was starved, including the St. Bernard dog, whose head and feet were the only things big enough for its breed. When he threw the 2 quarts of grain on the ground, their daily rations, chickens flew from every direction, just like a flock of pigeons, to fight for every grain they could find. I'll bet there wasn't a bird in that bunch that weighed over 1.5 pounds, all feathers. No wonder they could fly. It took all day to get that place scrubbed clean enough to move in. When you get 7 men as angry as we were with the whole mess, believe me, it's possible. The outhouse was only boarded in halfway down on the back end, and there were a lot of jokes about being nervous with that big hungry dog around. The open end faced a curve in the road, and therefore not too private either. We all felt sorry for that dog, and one of the men shot a full-grown snowshoe rabbit, which he brought back after a day's hunt. The poor dog was so hungry that he swallowed the whole thing, fur and all, in 2 giant gulps. He was our welcoming committee every day after that. A fresh snowfall one night made beautiful tracking for the next day. When we were no more than an hour into the bush, I crossed some tracks that were really fresh. It is always a great pleasure just to see where they go, even though your hopes of getting a glimpse of the one making them are pretty slim. No one had seen game to this point, and there's always a chance that you will drive the deer to one of the others, so I started out. The first half hour, the deer sauntered aimlessly in one general direction. Then, as the tracks indicated, it stopped and turned sideways, probably the first time it was aware that I was following. It took off in great bounds, and I thought, oh, I've blown it again. The bush was mostly hardwoods, of a good size and fairly well spaced, which allowed me to see a good distance. The humps and hollows were the most serious restriction. I followed at a good brisk walk because I felt it would not slow down for at least another 1/4 mile, and when I was half that distance I reduced speed to a real sneak in the hope of making as little noise as possible. Tension mounted as I strained eyes and ears for some movement ahead of me. The tracks swung to the left to go along the base of a good-sized knob, and when they had made a half circle, they proved the deer had stood watching me come over the crest of a little hill about 100 yards away. From there on, it was just one trick after another, backtracking through tangled undergrowth, jumping sideways, or just plain going like the devil. In each case, the tracks indicated that the deer had watched me from one concealed vantage point. By frequent compass checks, I knew we were making a great big circle, and when we came to the beginning of my own footprints, I knew I was beaten. It certainly does not help your ego to realize that a stupid deer is smarter than yourself. It would have been nice to have had at least one glimpse, but in spite of being dog-tired, I had enjoyed every minute of one beautiful day. On talking to John and Ellis recently, I find their memories are better than mine. We determined that our farmer's friend's name was Frank Gates, and it was he who volunteered his services, and those of his 16-year-old son, to act as our guides for the next day. The plan was the usual: put men on watches, and Frank and one of us drive a fairly small area towards them. The son was to lead us to our watches via another route, and after we had walked like what seemed forever, I had asked several times how much further. I always got a routine answer: just over the next hill. We climbed a dozen hills, and the day was slipping by. In desperation I asked, "Is it a mile, a half mile, or just how far is it?" He was cornered, and the answer we got was, "About 50,000 trees in that direction." We arrived at our positions just in time to see the drivers coming through, too late to be of any value. My guess is, the kid was lost and wouldn't admit it. By the end of the week, with no score at all, we decided to visit George Lonsbury and Lou Puttycombe, who were hunting with our other gang not too far away. We were shown great hospitality and traded stories for the best part of the day. In the afternoon, they organized 2 drives which yielded nothing, and a third drive, too close to dusk, which drove a deer to my watch. It zigzagged across an open field of high grass, bouncing with every jump, as if it were on coiled springs instead of legs. I missed it completely and took a razzing from the group. We talked and laughed some more, and when John jumped into his pickup truck to start for home, he did not notice my gun leaning on the front bumper. Everybody yelled a little too late to prevent the front wheel of the truck from passing over the barrel of the gun. And, to add insult to injury, John stopped and backed up to run over it the second time with the same wheel. When I picked it up, the barrel was bent in the middle, leaving the muzzle about 6 inches out of line. The action was not damaged, so I estimated the cost of repairs would not exceed the price of a new barrel. John felt terrible because he knew how much I liked that gun. The wisecracks from the group about how I could probably improve my shooting with an automatic lead on a running target, or great for around corners, etc., soon relieved the seriousness, and we all laughed all the way back to our camp. This was one of the few years we were skunked for game, but no one kicked a great deal, except about the accommodations. A week after we were home, Frank Lee introduced me to Jack Trathan, a gun buff in Hamilton, who put that bent barrel in a lathe and straightened it perfectly. I'm still using it with great confidence. Florence has always been a serious-minded person, even during her public school days at Fruitland. It would seem that she was never quite satisfied to be her present age, but always wished to be a few years older. As a direct result of this attitude, her childhood days were fraught with problems beyond her years, which in my opinion caused her to miss many of the innocent pleasures that most young children enjoy. She shunned group activities to favor one friend at a time, and competitive sports or games were not appreciated because someone had to lose. Florence was only 7 years old when Aunt Nell died in 1946, and her passing left a great void in Florence's life. Aunt Nell was always extremely active, enjoyed good health, and paid special attention to Flo. She had her own little apartment upstairs, using the present bathroom as her kitchen and the big room as her bedroom. Being nearly 80, her habits were well established, one of them being a short nap after noontime. We had heard her fixing something with a hammer and busily rushing around before noon, and paid no attention to what we thought was an extended sleep time. When we checked her bedroom just before 3 o'clock, we found she had quietly slept away. It was a shock to all of us, but for Florence it was most difficult to understand. Aunt Nell had repeated that old child's prayer for many years before retiring. "Now I lay me down to sleep, I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take." It would seem that her prayers were answered. It was a pleasure to teach Flo the many uses of the farm machinery, and she became quite proficient in driving a tractor by the time she was 9, certainly a big help on the farm. She loved animals and enjoyed tending their needs, especially if they were sick or injured. Horses were on the top of her list, and after Tom's death in '51, she became very interested in an old horse belonging to George Lonsbury. We had dispensed with our horses when I acquired the second tractor, an old Case, and I think the only reason George kept old Dan was because he could let him pasture in the fence power lines for little or no cost. Flo spent hours and hours with old Dan, and one call would see him running to meet her from any part of the 4 or 5 acres. In fact, whenever Dan would escape from the barn or pasture, George would call on Flo to recapture him, which she could do with the greatest of ease, thus saving George a lot of legwork. Her 16th birthday present was her license to drive a car. She had no trouble passing the test for a chauffeur's license, because I had given her permission to drive the car or truck on the farm for more than a year before this. Incidentally, I found out later that she did not always stick to the farm, but wandered as far off as Binbrook on occasion. She was not too long learning to handle the 1948 two-ton truck I used to haul milk from Stony Creek Dairy. The 500-gallon tank, especially when partly full, would push and pull, rock and roll, and required a certain amount of skill to keep it on the road. The dairy was usually jammed with trucks, and the narrow alley presented another problem to back into. The manager, Mr. George Hurst, told me that he had watched her many times and would give her a job driving for him any time. It was Flo's second year of driving experience when the dairy hired a new foreman in the yard. He was a young Danish lad, full of vim and vigor, very bossy and a little drunk with his newfound power. Flo drove to the proper place and loaded about half a tank of skim milk from the overhead tank when this new man spotted her. He jumped on the running board of the truck and instructed her to drive over there to pick up some odd cans of returned milk. She was required to go ahead and back up several times to get to the right position to load these cans, and she knew full well that a half tank of milk was not a load to be rushed. He insisted on more speed, as he did not have all day for one simple job. That did it. Flo put it in a forward gear and gave it the gas, and when it was moving fairly well, she hit the brakes. The lid on the foot square filling hole at the front of the tank was not a tight fit by any means. The milk rushed to the front of the tank, hit the lid, and completely drenched him from head to toe with half-sour milk. Needless to say, that was the last driving interactions Flo received from him. In the early summer of Flo's 17th year, we finally gave in to her persistent coaxing for a horse of her own. Rolf Natman helped us look for one that would suit. We found a black and white pinto named Cricket, claimed to be 12 years old and probably 14 or more, at Ken Sobel's Bar 11 Ranch west of Dundas. We soon found out that Cricket had been force-trained and would respond to a firm hand beautifully, just rejected kindness. To Flo, it was the only horse in Canada, and she proceeded to treat it the same as she had treated old Dan. I felt sure she was wrong, but was reluctant to force my opinion that she should have a more violent bit in Cricket's mouth. My suggestion that she replace the soft leather strap under Cricket's jaw with a small-sized chain was flatly rejected, and I can see now that I would have been much smarter to have insisted. In the center of the 12-foot door on the second floor of the barn, I made a smaller door 5 feet high and 2 feet wide for easy walking access. It was while returning to the stable from one of her many rides that Flo lost control. She had galloped from the foot of the escarpment down the side road, made the corner near the back door of the house, and was headed towards the barn. The big door was closed, the little one open. Flo couldn't stop the horse, and she was going too fast to get off. At the last moment, she ducked her head low on Cricket's neck, squeezed her legs in tight, and went through that door on a dead run. How, I'll never know. She certainly would not have made it if she had not been riding bareback. This was one of the few times I can remember Flo having a good cry. Not exactly the time to say, "I told you so." I called the trainer at Bar 11 Ranch, and he came. A few harsh words, a few jerks on the lines, and a wallop or two, and Cricket would behave like a lady. He even demonstrated how he could command her to stand, and then himself stand upright in the middle of her back. The demonstration put on by the trainer served to verify my opinion, and from that day on the small chain was standard equipment. For as long as Flo had that horse, which was well over 10 years, Cricket would take advantage of the loose or disconnected chain to either run like crazy or simply disobey all commands. While uploading the 40 or 50 young pigs I had bought at the auction sale into the barn, one of the little devils managed to escape. Normally, if the pig has been in the barn for a few days, there is no problem getting him to return. But here is one who has never seen his new home, so the only thing to do is to catch him. This is no small chore, because they can run fast and duck and dive better than a full-grown one. I solicited the help of a few kids in the neighborhood and set out. He crossed number 8 highway towards the north, turned east to cross DeWitt Road, then south to cross number 8 again. By the time we were halfway to the escarpment, we were all pooped and the pig was doing just fine. I was happy to see Flo riding Cricket towards home on DeWitt Road and yelled for help. To my surprise, she stayed on the horse. I had fully expected her to dismount and join the group. In no time at all, she and Cricket were on the far side of the pig, and from that point on there was no other direction he could go except towards the barn. Fast or slow made no difference. Quick stops, direction changes, or just standing still, Cricket was right beside him. Apparently, she had been trained for this type of action because Flo had all she could do to hang on and duck the many tree limbs in the orchard. Instruction or guidance were not necessary. Cricket did it all herself. All we had to do was open the barn doors and watch that little pig walk in. It was really something to see. Worldly possessions were about as important to Flo as a sore leg, and just as desirable. Her ambitions leaned heavily towards helping others, and I would suppose this is why she chose to enroll for nurses' training in the General Hospital of Hamilton in September of 1958. Nobody was ever more enthusiastic, and in an effort to share her feelings with me, she took me on a tour of the training part of the hospital after hours, which was strictly contrary to the rules. In Flo's view, if you are doing no harm or causing no damage to people or things, then the rules which prevent you from doing as you please are not important, so break them if you can get away with it. It is unfortunate that I did not check before accepting the invitation. For this misdemeanor, and probably a few I knew nothing about, Flo was expelled from the training course in December. Her disappointment was very evident, and we were all pleased when she decided to return to Saltfleet High School to pick up the 2 subjects she needed to complete her matriculation. Still convinced her career should be nursing, she enrolled that September 1959 in St. Catherine's General. There were dozens of interesting happenings during the 3 years of her training, but I think I will let her write her own book on that subject. Enough to say that she graduated in '62 and served another 2 years afterwards. More about Flo later. End of chapter 14.